Okay, looks like we're live. Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Peace be upon you all. My name is Noor Saleh, and I work in government relations at Minarat Foundation. Our focus is to lift American Muslim voices for sustainable change through multi-faith and civic engagement. We're joined by two guests. We have Pastor Chris Hall. Would you like to introduce yourself?
I would, thank you. My name is Pastor Chris Hall. I get to serve as the missions pastor at Houston Northwest Church, just off 249 and Cypresswood. Native Houstonian, grew up just around the corner, went to Klein High School and continue to connect with the community. So I appreciate the invite. I look forward to today's conversation.
And our candidate for the day is Bryan J. Henry, running for Texas House of Representatives in District 130. As a part of our candidate Q&A series, we are interviewing candidates running for office and learning more about their stance and issues concerning not just the Muslim community, but the multi-faith community as well. Thank you so much for joining us, Bryan.
Thank you for having me.
Let's jump right in. Can you give us some broad strokes about your platform?
Sure. So I'm a teacher and a parent, and I view most political issues through those lenses as a parent, as a teacher. And so in my campaign, I've been talking a lot about the need for good public schools, the need for all children to have access to healthcare, the need to have communities that are safe from gun violence, and the need to offer solutions to the climate crisis that today's children are going to face in their lifetimes.
For sure. Something that we're really focused with on this upcoming election and everyone's kind of watching is healthcare. So for decades, healthcare costs in the U.S. have risen faster than the rate of inflation. And within all these costs, 30% of healthcare spending is estimated to be unnecessary. So what policy solutions would you support to address the rising costs of healthcare?
Well, healthcare is a very complex issue. There are certain things that state government can do, and there are certain things that the federal government is more suited to fix. And, I'll just be honest, my opponent in this race has passed some legislation that is good around healthcare price transparency and surprise billing in ERs. And I applaud that. I myself have been the victim of some really high ER bills, not to gross you out, but, one instance like 4 years ago, I just started vomiting and, I was sick for like 8 hours and started to vomit blood, and where do you think my wife sent me? The ER, right? Where would you send your spouse or loved one? And all I needed really was some fluids. And I was there for 3 hours and I left with like a $3,500 bill. And so, that's a really shocking experience. You go somewhere because you need help, and then you leave with something that you're going to be paying off monthly for the next 2 years. And it's crazy. And so at the state level, I think some things have been done to curb that particular problem. Another issue with healthcare is the cost of prescription drugs. And state government has a role in regulating the price of prescription drugs. There are things that the state government can do. Ultimately, it's a federal issue. The federal government can take a much more aggressive stance to bring down the cost of prescription drugs for everyone without individual states needing to do so. But anyone who says they care about access to healthcare or care about the rising cost of healthcare, if they are against the Affordable Care Act, if they are in support of repealing that, I would say that they can't be trusted. Because before the Affordable Care Act, women could be charged more than men. People with pre-existing conditions could be charged more than those who are healthier. The individual provisions of that act are very popular. They have like 70% approval. When you cobble all of them together and call it the Affordable Care Act, it's a little less popular. When you call it Obamacare, it's even less popular. People will respond whether they like the law or not based on what you call it. And so the Affordable Care Act has done a lot to increase access and reduce costs. One of the ways it does that is it expands Medicaid. Texas is one of the only states that has not expanded Medicaid. If we do that, we're going to give a lot of people health insurance who currently don't have it, and we're going to have billions in federal dollars coming to our healthcare systems. This is a moral and economic no-brainer. And it's not a red versus blue, Republican versus Democrat thing anymore. Lots of Republican states have expanded Medicaid. We have the largest uninsured population in the country, and one of the ways to close that gap is to expand Medicaid. Now, it must be said, and I'll go into some detail if you don't mind, aspects of the Affordable Care Act did not work as intended. Roughly 85% of Americans get their health insurance from one of three places: their employer, Medicaid, or Medicare. The other 10 to 15%, they purchase a plan on the private marketplace. And those people can run into some serious problems, like the things I mentioned earlier: higher prices for pre-existing conditions or denial of coverage altogether. What the Affordable Care Act was supposed to do was it was supposed to increase competition and decrease costs. As you may know, what happened is a lot of young, healthy people did not sign up for those Obamacare plans. And so those risk pools were sicker than anticipated. So the costs went up and a lot of providers left because there wasn't any money to be made. And so the opposite happened. You had less competition and higher prices. Does that mean the Affordable Care Act failed? Not really. It just shows you the limits of relying on a market-based for-profit system to provide health insurance. And that's where the public option comes in. And that'll be sort of my closing remark here. We have to have a public option attached to the Affordable Care Act so that those people who are left over, who have to search for a plan elsewhere, they have a government-sponsored plan that can compete with these for-profit plans where there's lots of overhead and it's more expensive. It's those administrative costs that make the cost of healthcare increase. So the public option moving forward, in conjunction with expanding Medicaid, I think are two of the best ways to lower the cost of healthcare and increase access.
Yeah, for sure. I'm kind of switching gears here, going into education. Pastor Chris Hall, why don't you talk a little bit more about education and what effect certain policies can have?
Absolutely, I'd be glad to. So, Mr. Henry, I understand that as an educator yourself, you have relied on that experience for your current platform, and then also being myself married to a teacher, I hear some of the things that you have experienced personally, and it is a necessity for our community to invest in the education for tomorrow. But you may know that it's 50% more likely that a student arrested in high school will drop out before graduation. Many high school students are arrested due to misconduct. These arrests are often referred to as a school to prison pipeline. So can you just kind of talk through maybe just one concrete step or policy that you foresee taking to combat against this school to prison pipeline?
Yes, it's a troubling trend, and I think it's similar to the broader debate we're having about law enforcement reform right now, where I would argue you have two sides that are very passionate and polarizing, and the truth may be somewhere in the middle. So law enforcement has a role to play on a school campus. For me, that role is safety. If there's an active shooter situation, you're going to want an armed law enforcement official on that campus that can engage the shooter. What we don't want is law enforcement being used for student discipline. And that's where things go wrong. And it's a troubling development, and it's not everywhere. There's inequity here. I taught in a pretty affluent suburban high school, and maybe it's just anecdotal, I never saw law enforcement interacting with students the way that I read about law enforcement interacting with students in some more inner city urban schools. And you read these horrifying stories where a 5-year-old or an 8-year-old has been handcuffed, and they have, they basically have hyperactivity, and they're just not being shown the compassion they need, or the school is underfunded and they don't have the support services to deal with the root causes of why a child is acting out. And so we need to invest more in schools so they can have a holistic support of students, their mental health, their emotional health, home trauma. There are reasons that certain kids are acting out, and I don't think that law enforcement makes anything better. Some schools have had lots of success with restorative justice practices. This is sort of the catchphrase right now. And there's lots of evidence, empirical evidence, that it works. And so I think that as much as we can reduce the role of law enforcement for discipline and replace it with some of these more restorative justice practices, I think we can turn this around, this troubling trend.
Yeah, kind of on that same note of police reform, and Chief Acevedo and other police chiefs have gone on record saying that they believe that if an officer is fired from one precinct, that they should not be allowed to be rehired in another precinct. In Texas, for a police officer to be unable to be rehired, they have to be fired twice. Would you agree with Chief Acevedo and other police chiefs that officers should not be allowed to be hired once they've been fired?
I don't know that much about this policy. It sounds right to me. I do know that if there's a shortage for law enforcement professionals, it's possible a review process would be necessary so that somebody who was fired for a reason that maybe isn't as relevant to what they're needed for on the other campus. I would hate for schools to not have law enforcement officers if they need them, but not knowing much about that process, if an officer was fired, they were probably fired for good reason, and so it makes sense for them to not be rehired elsewhere. But again, there are situations where somebody's fired and it's complex, and maybe they could continue in a different capacity elsewhere. So I'm not giving a good answer there. It sounds right to me.
You spoke earlier about your passion about climate change and just making, a sustainable environment for children and for our future generations. As you know, recently New Zealand's Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern stated that by 2030, New Zealand would be carbon neutral. You're very passionate about climate change and sustainability. And what is one step that you would take to make this a reality? What types of climate change reform would you take into account? And how will you make sure that using your position that we have a sustainable environment for the future?
So Houston, Texas is considered the energy capital of the world. And much of our state budget, the revenue, comes from oil and gas production. And I want Texas to be the energy capital of the world 30 years from now. And the only way we're going to be is if we make smart investments now in renewable energy, because fossil fuels are going to decline. And so we have to prepare now before we are a backward state with an industry that is outdated. And one of the things we could do, in my opinion, is drastically increase the use of solar panels. We have huge suburbs, just urban sprawl, right? Suburban sprawl. And somebody's going to be manufacturing the solar panels of the world. And I think that Texas should be manufacturing those solar panels. We are the 10th largest economy in the world. If we were a country, we would want to compete internationally for manufacturing. I think we should become number one in the manufacturing of solar panels, and that we should have programs to put them on every house in the state.
That's awesome. Yeah, sustainability for the environment is extremely important. Another really important issue to many communities, including the Muslim community, is Islamophobia and all other forms of hate. In recent history, Congresspeople have shared worrisome posts regarding Muslim Americans and other minority groups. And recently, self-proclaimed Islamophobe Laura Loomer won the GOP nomination in Florida. Her hateful rhetoric surrounding Muslims is terrifying for all, but nonetheless, she's been very successful. What would your first step to be to combat Islamophobic and all other hateful forms of rhetoric, whether it's in legislation or just in public?
I mean, if I were elected, I would be a voice for inclusion, for tolerance. I think that, it's difficult. I was a student in the early 2000s after 9/11. I was in high school and I witnessed Islamophobia. And then not long after, I returned to the high school setting as a teacher. And I feel like I witnessed a lot less. That could be purely anecdotal, right? But it seemed to me that progress had been made over the intervening 10, 15 years with America's youth, that the youth had become more tolerant and accepting. And hopefully that's the case, right? As far as the adults in America are concerned and the political leaders, the rhetoric has become worse over the last 10 or 15 years. We saw the Republican Party become consumed with Barack Obama's middle name, Hussein. You had conspiracy theories that he was secretly a Muslim, as if that mattered, right? Even if it was true, right? What would that mean? And on foreign policy, there was an obsession from Ted Cruz and Donald Trump around using the phrase radical Islamic terrorism, that if you didn't use those exact words, you were somehow soft on terrorism. When there are legitimate foreign policy reasons to not use that phrase, to say nothing about the domestic impact that it has on American Muslims, where it creates this environment where the Muslim community is viewed suspiciously and with fear. And none of that has improved under Donald Trump. Anyone who says they care about Islamophobia or religious toleration, if they can't vocally separate themselves from the president's rhetoric and the rhetoric of the party, then I don't think they're being honest. We have lots of Christians in America who are championing religious liberty, but they're often doing it in a narrow manner where they just want license to use their faith to discriminate against others, where they would sort of look the other way if some other faith tradition is being discriminated against. So if we're going to talk about and champion religious liberty, I think we really need to be consistent about what it means and that it should be granted to everyone. I think Joe Biden is correct in that we are in a battle for the soul of the nation. We are either going to be a multicultural, multiracial, religiously pluralistic democracy, or we're not. And we have forces at work right now that are direct impediments to the creation of that type of society. What I've been talking about as a candidate and what I would talk about as an elected official is a tolerant, inclusive Texas where everyone feels that they are invited to fully participate in our economic and civic life, regardless of their country of origin, their ethnicity, their race, their religion, their sexual orientation.
Of course, kind of on that same note, one of the things that Islamophobia can cause and inspires hate crimes. Within the last 4 years, hate crimes against Muslims have risen to historic highs. These hate crimes have devastated families and communities. What would you do and how would you use your position to ensure that justice is served and that no other family or community would have to go through the violence and coping with this ever again?
I think a conversation should be had at the state and federal level about current hate crime laws. If there are ways to strengthen those laws to prevent hate crimes from occurring, then we should absolutely do that. I think it also starts with the rhetoric. Laws can only do so much. The leadership that is given from the national level to the state level to the local level creates a culture, creates an environment where people feel emboldened to commit hate crimes or not. And so absolutely we should change laws if there are laws to be changed. The first thing we can do is lead by example as elected officials. We can change our tone and we can reach out to communities and we can promote solidarity with others. We have to own our diversity. We have to own it as a strength. The politicians, their words matter. And we've learned that more than ever over the last 4 years. The things that politicians say matter. And right now, the biggest domestic threat we have of extremism is white supremacy, violent, anti-government white supremacists. It's not American Muslims. It's not refugees. It's not undocumented immigrants.
Of course. Earlier you talked about the diversity in Houston, and we all know that Houston's one of the most diverse cities in the United States. But it's just a talking point unless we see it reflected in our relationships and in our government. One of the best ways to get people involved in civic engagement is for them to be reflected and see themselves in government. What would you do to ensure diversity in all aspects of your office?
I would certainly look at hiring staffers and aides who are reflective of our state's diversity. Absolutely.
Awesome. You also mentioned refugees earlier. Pastor Chris Hall, would you like to speak a little bit about refugees in Texas?
Absolutely. So refugees and asylees has been a hot topic, not just recently, but over the last forever how long. Recently, President Trump has once again lowered the refugee cap to an all-time low. I think it's 15,000 for next year. Also, earlier this year, Governor Abbott tried to stop welcoming refugees into Texas altogether. So can you kind of talk on how you will continue to meet the needs of existing refugees and asylees currently residing in Houston and in the state, but at the same time, look to create more open borders for these two groups?
It's shameful. I mean, the state of Texas, and partly because we're just a big state, but we're one of the leaders in the United States for accepting refugees. We received the second most refugees after California. And our communities do a great job welcoming these people and helping them transition to a new life here in the US. And the fact that that good work has stopped for partisan political calculations is really sad. And so hopefully we will have new leadership soon where that trend of closing the door to refugees is reversed. And in terms of legislation that supports those efforts, we should be increasing the assistance to the services and the organizations that are doing that work. Those partnerships should be strengthened.
Yeah. You spoke a little bit about family separation earlier, and in light of General Jeff Sessions' comments regarding separating children from their families, we as people of faith find it morally wrong, and we are concerned. We are very concerned about the current state of family separation in Texas. As you may know, Texas hosts ICE facilities that have contributed to family separation, and at least 2,600 immigrant children were separated from their parents or caregivers. And they're now being held in for-profit detention centers in Texas. How do you plan to keep families together, and what steps would you take to ensure that no one is making money and profiting off of these children's trauma?
Again, Could you imagine us having this conversation 4 years ago? We live in a completely different country right now. Immigration, like healthcare, is a complex issue because it overlaps between state and federal jurisdictions. There's only so much the state can do. What Texas could do, which other states have done, and I would support doing this, we could pass legislation ending for-profit prisons from operating in our state. I would support doing that. As far as federal detention centers are concerned, there are state laws that govern some of the standards that those detention centers have to meet. And I know this because in my Texas government class that I teach, my students do a public policy project, and I had a young woman get up in front of the class and give a presentation, and she pointed to the screen and she said, "This is the facility that my aunt is currently in." Imagine that, right? Class really becoming real to their peers. And she went on to talk about the fact that this was back when children were being denied soap, toothpaste, whatnot. There are laws that we can pass so that if the federal government insists on there being a detention center in Texas, we can force those detention centers to at least meet some bare minimum standards regarding hygiene and nutrition. I would want to end the detention centers altogether. But that's just me. There's only so much the state can do because ultimately immigration is a federal issue.
Of course, this is so heartbreaking just to learn about the children and families that have to go through this. And our policymakers need to do a better job of making sure that children and families stay together. As we come to a closing, Pastor Chris Hall, would you like to talk a little bit more about relationships and how we love one another?
Sure. We see growth when we can look past some of the differences that we have between each other, whether it be politics, religion, various issues, be able to talk and have those conversations, but also be able to look at those that we are maybe opposed to and find out the good in them. We're seeing this in politics, right? The divisiveness, the partisan politics that have created such chaos in lives of everywhere across the state. So I'm curious, is just tell me one thing that you value about your opponent. I'm curious, kind of maybe as you look at what he's done in office or his life in general, something that you say, that guy's got it going right.
I don't know him personally. He seems to be very family oriented. He has 3 children, and I assume that raising them and loving them is one of his top priorities. And so, again, not knowing him, not knowing his family, I applaud what I perceive to be a commitment to his family.
That's great.
Yeah, on the same theme of family and values, an interfaith hero here in the U.S., he once said, "To see the other side, to defend another people, not despite your tradition, but because of it. That is the heart of pluralism." Kind of on that same note, how does your faith or spirituality or worldview drive your decision-making process, and how did it motivate you to run for public office?
So my faith journey has been interesting. I suppose all faith journeys are interesting. When I was a senior in high school, I read a book by Jim Wallace titled God's Politics, and it sent me on the improbable dual journey of becoming more spiritual and more progressive at the same time. And in the US, the idea of a progressive Christianity is often considered an oxymoron. But I've had a series of pastors that I've been blessed to know who have had an impact on me. One was a Baptist, One was a Methodist. One is I currently attend a United Church of Christ church, First Congregational Church of Houston, FCC. And what I've learned from all of these different denominations, and what I see also being taught in other faith traditions, is that there's more to life than individual self-interest. There is more to life than the competitive logic of the marketplace. There is inherent meaning and goodness in finding solidarity with others, especially those in need. And so religion has never been more important in America, because right now, the logic of partisan politics is power at all cost. The logic of the marketplace is competition, individualism, and religion's one of the only things that offers an alternative to that hyper individualistic, competitive worldview, where somebody says, why should I wear a mask? Because it's going to help somebody else stay healthy. I mean, we are suffering right now from a lack of empathy, a lack of compassion, a lack of solidarity. And for me, religion is the main source of most of those things. And so to the degree that religion can help our politics and our economics be more just, then that's how it influences my approach to public service.
That's beautiful. Very well said. Thank you so much for spending time with us today. My name is Noor Saleh, and I work within government relations at the Minaret Foundation, where our focus is to lift American Muslim voices for sustainable change through multi-faith and civic engagement. Today, we were joined by Bryan J. Henry, running for Texas House of Representatives in District 130, and Pastor Chris Hall. Thank you for being so generous with your time, Bryan and Pastor Chris, and God bless. Thank you.
Thank you for having me.